The tractor arrived on a flatbed on a Thursday afternoon in April of 2003, and nobody asked Ruth Callahan if she wanted it. The driver backed the trailer into her gravel lot, dropped the ramps, winched the machine off, left a single sheet of paper on the seat, and drove away before Ruth had finished walking from the house to see what was happening. She stood in the lot looking at the Massey Ferguson 3095 that was now sitting on her property. It had not been cleaned before delivery. The cab windows were filmed with dust. One rear tire was flat. There was a crack running across the top of the hood that someone had attempted to seal with silicone, unsuccessfully. She picked up the paper from the seat. It was a transfer of title, already signed, made out in her name. At the bottom, a handwritten note from Dale Pruitt, the owner of Pruitt Farm Equipment in Covington, Indiana. Ruth, this one's yours. Too far gone to sell. Good luck with it, Dale. Ruth Callahan read the note twice. Then she looked at the tractor again. Then she went inside and called Dale Pruitt. Dale answered on the second ring. He explained, without particular apology, that the Massey Ferguson 3095 had come in as a trade-in the previous month from a farmer who'd upgraded to a newer model. The machine had more hours on it than the farmer had disclosed, 11,400, not the 9,000 on the paperwork, and it had mechanical issues that the dealership's inspection had surfaced after the trade was already complete. The cost of making the machine retail-ready exceeded what the machine would bring on the used lot. Dale had eaten the trade-in value and needed the machine off his property. He knew Ruth did mechanical repair work out of her barn. He thought she might find it useful. Ruth asked if he'd considered asking her before dropping it in her lot. Dale said he'd figured she'd say yes if he asked and no if she thought about it too long. Ruth said that was not how decisions worked. Dale said he understood and that he was sorry, and that if she wanted him to come get it, he would arrange that. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are the mechanical issues?" Dale told her. Injection pump showing signs of failure, hydraulic pump leaking at the rear seal, front axle bearings worn to the edge of specification, cab pressurization system not functioning, one hydraulic cylinder with a bent rod from what appeared to be an impact. Ruth said, "And you couldn't move it on the lot with all that?" Dale said, "Not at a price that made sense." Ruth said, "What would you have gotten for it, fixed up?" Dale said, 18, maybe 19,000 in good condition. Parts and labor to get there would have run 12 to 14, didn't pencil out. Ruth did the arithmetic in her head. She said, "I'll keep it." Dale said he appreciated it. Ruth hung up and walked back out to the lot and stood in front of the Massey Ferguson 3095 with its flat tire and its filmed windows and its handwritten note, and began in the methodical way she approached everything mechanical to think about what it would take to make it run. Ruth Callahan was 44 years old in 2003. She had been doing agricultural equipment repair out of a converted dairy barn on her 40-acre property outside Attica for 11 years, since 1992, when her husband Frank had died of a heart attack at 51 and left her with the property, a modest life insurance payout, a barn full of tools he'd accumulated across 30 years of weekend mechanical work, and no particular plan for what came next. She had not planned to go into equipment repair. She had taught high school agriculture for 14 years and understood machinery in the theoretical way that agricultural education requires, well enough to teach it, not deeply enough at first to rebuild it. But the barn was there and the tools were there, and the property had a gravel lot with room for several machines. And Frank's contacts in the farming community had known Ruth for years and trusted her. And in the months after Frank died, several of them had brought equipment to the barn for repairs. They couldn't get scheduled at the dealerships, which were backed up and expensive and sometimes a long drive away. Ruth had done the first repairs cautiously, referencing service manuals she ordered from Watseka and calling Frank's mechanic friend in Fountain County when she was uncertain. The work was good. The farmers came back. By 1994, she had enough steady business to justify investing in additional tooling, and by 1996, she had a reputation across 3 counties for honest, thorough work on equipment that other shops had given up on or priced out of reach for smaller operations. She specialized, gradually and without planning it that way, in Massey Ferguson equipment. Not because of any particular affinity for the brand, but because the farms in her area that couldn't afford new equipment skewed toward older Massey Ferguson iron, and the nearest Massey Ferguson dealer was 40 miles away and not known for enthusiasm about older models. The gap was real, and Ruth filled it, and filling it required her to develop a depth of knowledge about the brand that went beyond what the service manuals contained, and into the specific mechanical character of machines that had accumulated years of field use, and required someone who understood not just what the book said, but what the metal was telling you when the book and the metal disagreed. By 2003, Ruth Callahan's barn was the place that farmers in 4 counties brought Massey Ferguson equipment that other shops wouldn't touch. She had a waiting list. She had 3 used parts tractors parked along the back fence that she cannibalized for components she couldn't source through normal channels. She had a reputation that cost her nothing to maintain because it was built on a simple foundation. She said what was wrong, she fixed what she said was wrong, and she charged what the work was worth. Dale Pruitt knew all of this when he dropped the 3095 in her lot. He was not doing her a favor exactly. He was depositing a problem he didn't want at the address most likely to solve it. Ruth understood this. She did not hold it against him, but she noted it the way she noted everything, accurately and completely, without inflation, filed in the part of her accounting that tracked what people were actually doing, as distinct from what they said they were doing. What Dale had done was hand her a machine that he had decided was worthless. Ruth had looked at the same machine and made a different calculation. The difference between their calculations was the difference between what the machine cost to fix at dealership labor rates and what it cost to fix when the labor was Ruth's own, and the parts came from her cannibal stock and her supplier relationships that she'd built across 11 years of buying components for machines other people had given up on. She went to work on it the following Monday. The injection pump came out first. Ruth had rebuilt 3 injection pumps in the previous 2 years, 1 on a 3060, 2 on older Massey Ferguson models, and the process was documented in her own notes as well as the service manual. She ordered a rebuild kit from her supplier in Indianapolis. Parts cost $280. Time, 2 days. The hydraulic pump rear seal was a 4-hour job. She had the seal in her parts stock. It fit several Massey Ferguson models from that era, and she kept a supply because it failed with enough regularity to make stocking it sensible. Parts cost $40. Time, half a day. The front axle bearings took 3 days because one of the bearing races had spun in its housing and required machining work that Ruth sent out to a shop in Covington. That was the largest single cost of the restoration, $160 for the machining, plus $85 for the bearings themselves. Time, 3 days, including the day waiting for the machining to come back. The cab pressurization system had failed because a foam seal around the cab door had deteriorated. Ruth cut a replacement from sheet foam she kept for exactly this kind of improvised repair, sealed it with contact adhesive, and tested the system. It held. Cost, $6 in materials and 40 minutes of her time. The bent hydraulic cylinder rod was the job she'd been least certain about. Straightening a bent rod without creating stress concentrations that would cause it to fail under load required equipment she didn't have. She sourced a used cylinder from one of her parts tractors, a 3090 that had been sitting along the back fence for 2 years, and the cylinder fit with minor modification to the mounting bracket. Cost, her own labor and the time to pull and modify. Parts cost, $0. Total parts expenditure to restore the Massey Ferguson 3095 to working condition, $571. Total time, 11 working days spread across 3 weeks, worked around her existing repair jobs. On a Tuesday morning in early May, Ruth started the engine for the first time since the machine had arrived in her lot. It ran rough for 30 seconds. She let it warm, the roughness smoothed. She engaged the hydraulics. They responded correctly. She drove the machine out of the barn and across her lot and back in and shut it down. She sat in the cab for a moment. Then she climbed down and called Dale Pruitt. She told him the machine was running. Dale said that was something. Ruth said it was. She said she was keeping it. Dale said he hadn't expected otherwise. Ruth said she knew. She did not tell him what she'd spent to fix it. She did not tell him what she was thinking about doing with it next. She just said the machine was running and thanked him for the transfer of title and hung up. What Ruth was thinking about was not, at first, a business plan. It was a mechanical observation that had been forming across 11 years of repair work and had crystallized in the 3 weeks she spent restoring the 3095. The observation was simple. The Massey Ferguson equipment that came through her barn was not failing because it was bad equipment. It was failing because it had been maintained incorrectly or not at all. The machines were sound. What they lacked was consistent, knowledgeable attention, the kind that the gap between dealership prices and what small operators could actually pay meant they frequently didn't receive. Ruth had been filling that gap reactively for 11 years. Farmers brought broken equipment. She fixed it. What crystallized over the 3095 restoration was that the gap could be filled proactively. Preventive maintenance, fixed price, scheduled, less repair, more prevention. She wrote it in the spiral notebook on the barn workbench. Then she spent 2 weeks talking to farmers she worked with regularly, asking what they were skipping, what breakdowns they'd had, what proper maintenance might have prevented. She didn't tell them what she was planning. She just listened. What she heard confirmed the observation. Oil changes deferred. Filters run past their service life. Fittings not greased. Pre-season inspections skipped because the time and cost competed with everything else the operation required, and in that competition, maintenance always lost. Ruth drafted a service agreement in July of 2003, a flat annual fee covering scheduled oil changes, filter replacements, fluid services, greasing, and a pre-season inspection on up to 3 tractors. The fee was $480 per machine per year. She calculated her costs and her time and determined she could honor the agreement at that price and come out ahead of what she was making on reactive repairs, because preventive maintenance is faster and cheaper to do than repair work, and the volume of agreements would provide a predictable income base that reactive repair could not. She mailed the agreement to 22 farmers in September of 2003. 14 of them signed within 30 days. By January of 2004, she had 19 signed agreements covering 41 machines. The Massey Ferguson 3095 that Dale Pruitt had dropped in her lot became her demonstration unit. She used it to show farmers what a properly maintained machine looked like from the inside, what clean oil looked like at the right change interval, what a hydraulic system looked like when the fluid was fresh and the seals were intact, what an injection system looked like when the filters were current. Farmers who had never seen their own equipment from the inside found the demonstrations clarifying in ways that descriptions alone couldn't achieve. The service agreement business grew across 2004 and 2005 in the way that businesses grow when they are solving a real problem at a price people can pay, steadily, through word of mouth, without advertising, driven by the specific recommendation that comes from one farmer telling another that something worked. By the end of 2005, Ruth had 47 service agreements covering 108 machines across 4 counties. She had hired 1 part-time assistant, a retired mechanic named Jim Borst, who had worked for a KIH dealer for 22 years and whose knowledge of agricultural equipment was both broad and specific in the ways that mattered. Jim worked 3 days a week and was paid fairly and understood the operations philosophy without needing it explained, because the operations philosophy was the same philosophy he had tried to apply at the dealership and had been told repeatedly was incompatible with the dealership's cost structure. Ruth bought a used service truck in 2004, a 3/4-ton pickup with a service body, purchased at a county auction for $6,000. She stocked it with the tools and parts she needed for scheduled maintenance calls and drove it to farms across 4 counties on a rotation that she'd worked out to minimize drive time while maximizing the number of machines she could service in a day. The truck was not new, and it was not impressive, and it did the job it was purchased to do without requiring her to finance anything. The Massey Ferguson 3095 stayed in her barn. She used it for her own property work, maintaining her 40 acres, keeping the lot and the drive clear, occasionally lending it to a farmer who needed a machine while their own was in for repair. It had crossed 13,000 hours by 2006. Ruth rebuilt the clutch that year. The engine, which she had never opened beyond routine maintenance, ran as it had run when she first started it in May of 2003. In 2006, a farmer named Gerald Watts drove to Ruth's barn from 2 counties away. He'd heard about her service agreements from a neighbor who had been on one since 2004 and asked if she was taking new customers. Ruth said she had capacity for a few more. Gerald signed an agreement for his 3 Massey Ferguson tractors and his combine. He told 2 other farmers in his county about her before the end of the year. Both of them called. By the end of 2007, Ruth's service agreements covered 63 farms and 181 machines. Her annual revenue from agreements alone was just over $200,000. Jim Borst had gone to full-time. Ruth had hired a second mechanic, a 28-year-old named Sarah Kendig, who had grown up on a farm in Benton County and had taught herself equipment mechanics the same way Ruth had, through necessity, repetition, and service manuals read seriously. The barn that had been Frank's weekend project had been expanded twice. The gravel lot that the flatbed had backed into in April of 2003 now held a service truck, a parts inventory, and 3 machines in various stages of maintenance. The Massey Ferguson 3095 that Dale Pruitt had decided was too far gone to sell sat along the back fence, clean, running, available. The financial crisis of 2008 moved Ruth's business in the opposite direction from most agricultural enterprises. Farms cutting costs deferred maintenance longer. The machines that arrived at her barn in 2009 and 2010 were in worse condition than before. Each skipped service interval, creating conditions that accelerated the deterioration the next skipped interval made worse. Ruth's service agreement customers did not have this problem. Their machines were maintained on schedule regardless of commodity prices, because the cost was fixed and already paid. When 2009 came and credit tightened, her customers' equipment continued to receive the attention it required. The farms that came to her with catastrophic failures, injection systems run dry, hydraulic pumps failed because 18-month-old seals had finally given out, axle bearings that had been past specification for 2 seasons before failing during planting. Those farms enrolled in service agreements after the repair was done. The repair had made the cost of deferred maintenance concrete in a way that projections never could. By 2011, Ruth had 91 service agreement customers covering 247 machines. Her annual revenue had crossed $400,000. She had 3 mechanics on staff, including herself, 2 service trucks, and a parts inventory that she managed with the same precision she applied to everything else, buying at the right price, stocking what turned over, not carrying what didn't. She had also, without planning it, become something that she had not anticipated when she drafted the first service agreement in July of 2003. She had become the institutional memory for Massey Ferguson equipment in her part of Indiana. The knowledge she had accumulated across 2 decades of repair work and 9 years of systematic preventive maintenance, what failed and when and why, and what the early signs were and what the fix required, was not written down anywhere except in her spiral notebooks and in her head and in the heads of the mechanics she had trained. It was knowledge that no dealership had and no service manual contained, because it was empirical knowledge built from direct observation of a specific population of machines in a specific operating environment across a specific span of years. Farmers knew this. They drove past dealerships to reach her barn. They waited for her schedule when the dealerships had immediate availability. They trusted the diagnosis she gave them, because the diagnosis had been right the last time, and the time before that, and the time before that. The trust was real, and it had been earned, and it was worth more than any advertising could have purchased. In March of 2013, Dale Pruitt called Ruth. He was selling Pruitt farm equipment. He was 67 years old, and his son had decided not to take over the business, and he had decided not to find a buyer who would run it differently than he had, and the simplest outcome was to close. He wanted to know if Ruth was interested in his parts inventory before he put it up for auction. Ruth drove to Covington the following day. She spent 3 hours going through Dale's parts shelves, pulling what she could use, pricing it against her own costs, making offers that she calculated correctly and paid when Dale accepted. She spent $4,200 on parts that would have cost her $6,000 through her regular supplier, and that she would have needed to order anyway across the following 18 months. Before she left, Dale walked her through the shop one more time. He looked at the service bays, the alignment rack, the lift equipment. He said, "You know, when I dropped that tractor at your place in 2003, I thought I was doing you a favor." Ruth said, "I know you did." Dale said, "What did you end up doing with it?" Ruth told him, the restoration, the demonstration unit, the service agreements it helped her develop. The business that had grown from the observation the restoration had crystallized. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much is the business doing now?" Ruth said, "Enough." Dale looked at her. Then he smiled, the first time she'd seen him smile in 20 years of knowing him. He said, "I dropped a worthless tractor at your place and you built something worth $500,000 around it." Ruth said, "You dropped a tractor that you decided was worthless." "I made a different decision." Dale said, "You were right." Ruth said, "The machine was right. I just paid attention to what it was telling me." She loaded her parts into her truck and drove home. The Massey Ferguson 3095 was in its usual spot along the back fence when she pulled into the lot. 14,300 hours on the meter. Engine original, running clean. Dale Pruitt had decided in 2003 that it was too far gone to sell. Ruth had decided it was worth fixing. The difference between those two decisions, the gap between what a machine costs to restore at dealership rates and what it costs to restore when you know what you are doing and have the parts and the patience, had become, across 10 years, a business that employed 3 people and served 91 farms and held the mechanical knowledge of a region in a set of spiral notebooks on a barn workbench. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had designed it. A dealer had dropped a problem at an address that turned out to be the wrong address for a problem and the right address for a decision. And the decision, made on a Tuesday morning in May of 2003, when Ruth Callahan started an engine that hadn't run in months and listened to it find its idle, had been building itself ever since. The engine was still running. So was everything it had started.